This is the Grape Escape, and it's one of my favorite mechanical board games. Originally released by Parker Brothers in 1992, it was then re-released under the name Smashed Potatoes by Hasbro Games in 2010, and then brought back under the original name, the Grape Escape, in 2022. So let's have a look at the original version, the repackaged version, and the updated version and see what's changed over the last 30 years. So starting out, we're gonna have a look at the Parker Brothers edition, and of course we're gonna have a look at the box art, which I absolutely love this box art. They've got the very whimsical grapes playing the game. They've got all these little grape buddies watching the progress. Lots of fun. There's nothing too fancy to write home about on the back. They've got some nice close-up shots of the traps working, so you get to see the little Play-Doh or Grape Goo grapes getting smashed up, so you see how the machine works, and of course a bunch of kids having a good time playing the game. Pretty garden variety game art, but I feel like this iconic box is really going to get the member berries going for a lot of the people watching this video today. Now, I did bring up a point while I was talking about that. Since this was a Parker Brothers license, they didn't have the rights to Play-Doh, and the characters are actually made of, basically off-brand Play-Doh. So what they did was they called it Grape Goo, which I absolutely think is fantastic. It's just a hilarious little name for it. But the whole point of the game is these tiny little grapes have to make their way out of a mechanized jam factory, packed to the gills with traps designed to squish, squash, and smush our little grapes. And the rules are pretty brutal. Getting through this game, you're gonna get smashed and restart a lot. It's a lot of fun, and it's made for, I believe, ages 5 and up, but honestly, it's great for all ages. Now, in 2010, by this time, Hasbro had incorporated Parker Brothers and Milton Bradley into their brand Hasbro Games. And it's obvious what they did was they took the general design of the Grape Escape and combined it with the Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head license and their official Play-Doh license, which is brilliant marketing, but I can see where this looks more like a Play-Doh playset than an actual board game and might have been a bit detrimental to its sales. It's got some great colorful box art, recognizable characters. You got these tiny little spuds that run through the restaurant and try to escape unscathed. And of course, Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head looking on, which, kind of makes it scary because it feels like you're guiding their kids through a deadly restaurant, which is sort of horrific. The box art is very reminiscent. I got a few little pieces in there. It's very reminiscent of the original box art from the Grape Escape. You've got a family having a good time playing the game, and of course some close-up shots of the traps in action. So nothing too revolutionary there, but I do like the bright colors. It's very eye-catching, and it's a unique license. It's definitely not the same on the outside as the Grape Escape, though to the trained eye you'll recognize some similarities between the traps and the game board itself. So let's dive into that. With the 1992 Parker Brothers release, you have the scissors, you have the boot, you have the little jam roller, and there's a little hacksaw kind of deal that cuts the grapes in half. When we go into the 2010 Smashed Potatoes, instead of a hacksaw, you have a little cleaver. Now, this is not run by the machine. The player actually just activates it by hand. The hand crank machine only affects the shears or scissors and the roller, which makes its return. There's also a little French fry basket now, which thematically matches the Smashed Potatoes game, and again is operated just by the player there. I'll give them a pass because it's a little flimsy there. I'll give them a pass on changing this out because I will admit the mechanized boot was kind of underwhelming in the original edition, and the saw never really worked very well as we noticed when we were filming our short version of this covering the original Grape Escape. So I would take most of the changes to the mechanism as being a plus, as a lot of the parts that formerly required rubber bands no longer require a rubber band. The shears, for instance, the shears are rubber band powered on the 1992 edition, and there's kind of a loud crank noise when you'd work the crank on the 1992 edition, whereas in the 2010 Smashed Potatoes, it's much quieter, the action's much smoother, And due to the absence of rubber bands, it doesn't feel very jerky. It's very easy to run. The game board design is very similar to the original Grape Escape as far as the path, though obviously the board art for the 1992 Grape Escape is significantly better. If you take some time and look at this board art, it's fantastic. The amount of detail, the whimsical design, it's a blast. Whereas this feels a bit more commercial. It feels very two-dimensional. They're definitely pushing the Play-Doh license and the Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head license. And that kind of goes into one of the other interesting things that I noticed was the character molds. So for the original Grape Escape, you have this kind of big, bulky mold, and it makes a generally, you know, perplexed, kind of frightened little grape. But a nondescript grape is designed to be basically cannon fodder. He's going to get smashed and remolded so many times. So, of course, he looks a little bit scared and a little cartoony. When you get into the Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head molds, I was actually kind of scared when I opened the game because I thought I was actually going to have to walk Mr. Potato Head through one of these traps and cut him apart, or run Mrs. Potato Head through the roller. But as it turns out, both molds are just these blank generic spuds. So they're these little guys that are pictured on the box and on the board, which is great, except for then it kind of feels like Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head's kids are running through the restaurant. So it adds this extra macabre layer to the theme of the story. I don't know. It's still a kid's game. It's still the same theme, but with the personification of the potatoes, it starts to add a little weird element there. So a little bit of creepiness that I found kind of funny. Also, a significant change from the original Grape Escape. The original Grape Escape used a single die that included numbers for you to be able to move and actions such as turning the crank or grape leap, which allowed you to leap ahead of the leader. In this instance, Smashed Potatoes replaces that with a spinner that has the same numbers and the same actions, but no die. So maybe it's a little bit easier for kids to play. I did like that the tail end of it has a big chunky piece there for you to flick that's not going to hurt your fingernail. I normally hate spinners in games because you always end up nicking your nail on the spinner itself, or the actual plastic's really hard. In fact, you might not be able to see it, but the fins on the back of this arrow not only stick up, but there's two of them right next to each other. They act kind of like a neat little shock absorber. It's not one solid hard piece. So very easy to move, doesn't hurt your fingernail. So win for Smashed Potatoes for that. I actually do like that spinner, and I hate spinners in these kind of games. So there you go. The traps, I can see where in Smashed Potatoes, by removing the mechanism from the cleaver and from the French fry machine, it allows the overall gameplay to improve. It feels a little cheaper, but overall, I mean, fighting with this, we did a short earlier this week where I was operating this machine, and it really made the whole game board shake when you were smashing the grapes on it. And the traps didn't really feel all that effective. What I can say about Smashed Potatoes is the traps do feel very effective, and it doesn't feel like I've, like, that's so scary. I cut this poor little guy in half. It doesn't feel as difficult to operate, like I have to brace the board down, whereas when I'm operating the crank on the Grape Escape, I'm definitely in need of holding that board down, or it's going to make me shift everything around. When we go into the 2022 edition of Grape Escape, we've now gone into fun box art, a little bit more modern take. I do like, the little grape rushing. I do like that they make an issue of having the boot, the classic iconic boot from the original game, makes its return, but it's the only trap from the original Grape Escape that makes its return. If you notice, we don't get the roller, we don't get the saw, we don't get the shears. Instead, we get an updated version of the French fry machine, the cleaver. We get this sort of, I don't know what you would call this, like a spin saw, radial arm saw. And then we get the boot and oddly a catapult, which we'll get to in a minute. Classic box art, a little bit more congested on the back here, but kids having a good time playing the game, close-ups of the traps operating. So classic fare. I do like the new updated logo. I think the updated logo is sharp. They include the Play-Doh licensing, but it's not as prominent as on Smashed Potatoes. So this doesn't feel like it's product placement the board game. This feels like they're actually going back to Grape Escape. The problem is the gameplay has changed enough that it doesn't feel like they went to the original Grape Escape. You do have the traps, but there's no mechanism in the center of the board. They're all individual self-contained traps that are all operated by the player. They're not horribly exciting. Like my little smasher here isn't quite the same. Ooh, sticks to that. And they're flimsy. They come apart very, very easy. So not even gonna try on that one. One win that I'll give you on the modern one is I do like the mold. The grape is a little bit wilder looking, a little bit more cartoony than the original grape. So I do think that's awesome. But taking the gameplay, reducing it to a traditional 6-sided die, and then having all of the special actions be spaces on the board, to me, kind of changes the dynamic of the gameplay a little bit too much. The original Grape Escape, having the actions and the numbers separate on one die, and if you actually look at the original rules, it was very easy to get all 4 traps filled quickly with players, smashed, and back to restart. It was a very brutal game. You were constantly getting smashed, remolding, and starting from the beginning. The rules to this Grape Escape, they don't feel quite as brutal, and also it just feels different. It feels not different in a good way. What drove me nuts about it was that since everything is on a particular space on the game board, it's not the random nature of what you spin or what you roll, but where you land. And I know that that seems like a subtle difference, but it somehow makes the game feel more repetitive than having your fate tied to the die or the spinner just in and of itself. So having the actions on the board was something that I was not fond of as a change with the game. I had also mentioned the catapult part. Well, that's a piece of the game that I'm not a big fan of. So as you work your way through the Jam Factory and the new version of the Grape Escape, of course, once players get to the end, they want to have a grand exit. So the rules in the game are, once you've made your grape, this is a horrible molding, but once you've made your grape to the end, you place him in the catapult and launch him. Well, there's no board or no goal to the launch. So here, if you play the original Parker Brothers Grape Escape, when your grape escapes, they just get to the finish line and they're done. If you play Smashed Potatoes, they get to the finish line and they're done. But if you play the new modern Grape Escape, now you're encouraging the players to take a soft Play-Doh character. I'm gonna do it again because I love the sound effect. Let's enjoy this for a second. Just goes down smooth every time. You're still having your characters launch a soft Play-Doh game character off into the carpet or whatever's going on in your house. So I don't really get why that's part of the game. It feels to me like a poorly thought out trap that somebody really wanted to include because it looked like a lot of fun. And maybe they should have replaced one of these other flimsy traps like the fry maker here that carried over from Smashed Potatoes, which, you know, it's funny that they both the fry maker and Smashed Potatoes and this little, I don't know what you'd call it, grater from the modernized Grape Escape, both feel exceptionally flimsy by comparison to the other traps in their respective games. So maybe that wasn't the most well thought out trap. In the end, I love Grape Escape. I think it's a blast. I think the big draw to the original 1992 edition would have to be the mechanism. I mean, everybody sees this Jam Factory, the art on the board, and it's eye-catching. It's brightly colored. Yeah, the old mechanism with the crank that clicks really loud and the rubber band powered machines is kind of janky, but there is also a certain level of charm. It's eye-catching. People want to play the game, and kids absolutely love it. It's just whimsical enough. The characters are fun. You put them in the little machines and oh no, they get smashed and you have to start over again. Nobody gets hung up on being competitive because it's so easy to get put back to the start. It's all about the mayhem that occurs on your way to winning the game. And I think that same spirit carries over into smashed potatoes. Do the traps feel a bit more tame? Of course. Does this feel a bit more like a cash grab as far as licensing? I mean, artistically, the game board's not as attractive. Does that really matter to the core audience? I think most 5-year-olds are going to see Mr. Potato Head or Mrs. Potato Head and the Play-Doh licensing and think of that fondly. Adults are going to see it and see marketing. So it is a bit of a detractor for adults. I don't think that kids are going to care. Going to the 2022 edition of Grape Escape, I enjoy that it feels a lot less commercialized than smashed potatoes. I actually do think that the art on the game board is cute. It's significantly smaller overall, which immediately makes the game feel a little bit cheaper. The material the board's made of is much thinner, which makes the game feel cheaper. Having all of the mechanical traps be hand operated, and as we saw, not always the best fit of plastic molds, and clearly they use the same parts designed to be interchangeable. So again, it feels like a lot of this game was designed around being cost effective as opposed to being fun. Now, what I will give them points for is I always appreciate a board game that packs up into a small package because, you know, space is a premium these days. I do like the updated mold for the grape. It requires significantly less Play-Doh to fill the grape mold and get a good cast with this little flip mold. And I do love the cartoony personality of the grape on this one. So, you know, honestly, it was worth tracking down a 2022 edition because if I play the 1992 edition, I'm probably going to use the grape mold because it's easier to use and I like the way that the characters look. It's worth tracking down. It is a lot of fun. I do have my gripes, and I do think that the 2022 edition is a massive downgrade by comparison to the Grape Escape or the 2010 Hasbro Games version Smashed Potatoes. I would say that aficionados of the mechanical games would probably want to gravitate towards Smashed Potatoes or the original Grape Escape as opposed to the updated 2022 edition. Though I do think the updated 2022 edition, it is a viable board game for young kids. It is still a blast to play for its target audience. I mean, I can't think of any kids that wouldn't enjoy smashing up grapes just like we did in the 90s. I just feel like there's less of a draw because of the lack of, well, mechanical madness. I mean, part of what made the 1992 edition so charming was the Rube Goldberg feeling of this machine. Everything was connected to everything else. It was fun to watch when somebody operated it. When you go into Smashed Potatoes, it's still fun to watch when somebody operates it, but really the only two things that are connected are the shears and the roller, which sure, you get a great effect from them, but it just doesn't feel the same. So, oh, and I got my little, this was supposed to be the spud that I put in there. Oh no, I put a grape in the Smashed Potatoes. I guess I wrecked the game. It's a neat carryover. It's a little less ornate and I think artistically less inspired. You get into this and the 2022 edition of Grape Escape overall, well, when you cut costs, you kind of get what you paid for. So anyway, neat little history going through 3 different iterations of the game and a complete rework where we're changing over the licensing. So it's neat to see the evolution of Parker Brothers' Grape Escape, Hasbro's Smashed Potatoes, and Hasbro's Grape Escape over the course of 30 years.